My name is Peter Young, and I'm president of Societe de Chimie Industrielle, and I really want to welcome all of you to what is a very exciting panel and a very exciting topic that is going to affect everyone who's in attendance for many years, and that is the whole issue of ESG. What I'd like to do as president is just to give you a brief introduction before I turn it over to Duane Dickson, who is one of the two moderators for this event, along with Josh Spector, and who also is a member of the board of directors of Societe de Chimie Industrielle. So if all of you can see the first of three slides. So we have three outstanding representatives from companies who really know a great deal about the topic, which is the ESG movement. Where are we headed? And again, as I said, we have Josh Spector of UBS Investment Bank as a co-moderator, along with Duane Dickson of Deloitte. One of the things we want to do is to thank our gold event sponsor, Deloitte, who is a sponsor of this event. We have sponsors for all of our webcasts, and we want to thank Deloitte for their sponsorship of this event. And the last thing I want to say is two things. One is that one of the things we started this last year is that whenever we have a hot topic like this one, we also have a companion discussion group that goes along with it a couple of weeks later. So if you go to the Societe de Chimie Industrielle, societe.org website, there's a list of it as one of the events, and you can register, and that is purely a discussion group. Last, I just want to talk about the two upcoming events. On April 28th, we'll have a discussion group on the supply chain crisis, challenge, impact, and solutions. We had a wonderful panel the other day that really went through all the serious problems that are happening, and not just the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And on May 6th, we have the ESG movement discussion group, which I mentioned before. And last, on May 12th, we have the CEO of Integris, Bertrand Loy, who will do a fireside chat on success through unconventional wisdom. And they're a really extraordinary company, trading at some very high multiple and growing rapidly. But he's going to talk about some of the things they've done, which is not normally what conventional wisdom dictates, that has led to their success. So we hope you will join us for one of these three events coming up. And with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Duane Dickson, again, who's the co-moderator for this event, and also a member of the board of Societe de Chimie Industrielle.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. Today we have a very timely session that's entitled The ESG Movement and Where We're Headed. We definitely plan to focus today's webcast on four themes: environmental, sustainability, and governance in the ESG acronym, as well as audit and tracking and reporting. What we really want to do is not only talk about these as current trends, but also try to apply them to what it means for the chemical industry. I'm going to be a co-host today with Josh Spector, who's Director of Equity Research at UBS Investment Bank. And the format for today is we're going to ask each speaker to give some introductory remarks. Then there'll be a panel session with each of our three presenters, and we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So you can type your questions in at any time into the chat feature. Just a quick introduction of our panelists. First, Dr. Julie Hudson, Global Head of ESG Research for UBS Investment Bank. She spent over 25 years at UBS and over 16 years in ESG research, and she's written many external reports on ESG. Dr. Haakan Jonsson, who is Chairman and President of Covestro LLC. He brings more than 25 years of various business experience to the position. He began his career with Bayer in 1992 as a scientist. He's held various positions both in the US and Germany. These include Director of Manufacturing for the Bayer Corporation, VP of Innovation for the Americas and in Bayer Polymers, and VP and Head of Business Development for the polycarbonate business. He also was a Senior VP and Head of the North American and European, Middle East, Africa, Latin America Supply Chain Centers, and has also been Senior Vice President and Head of Global Innovation for PCS. And my colleague, Kyle Tanger, who is a Sustainability Consulting Leader at Deloitte. Prior to working with Deloitte, Kyle was the founder and CEO of Clear Carbon that merged into Deloitte. He specializes in corporate and social responsibility for the chemical, retail, and consumer product industries. And he's known for helping companies grow revenues and manage costs relating to this ESG topic. He brings significant operations experience in resource management, as well as life cycle analysis and supply chain experience. We're going to start with Haakan. He's going to kick us off and talk a little bit about how Covestro is working through ESG and about the company's activities in that area. Welcome, Haakan.
Thank you. Thanks, Duane, and hi, everyone. But before I get started, I would like to thank Societe, and I thank you also, Duane, for the opportunity to speak here this morning, or I guess afternoon still. Yeah, as Duane just mentioned, my name is Haakan Jonsson. I'm the president and chairman of Covestro LLC, which is the US legal entity of our German parent Covestro AG. So Covestro is among the world's largest polymer companies. In our business activities are focused on the manufacture of what we call high-tech polymer materials, and also development of innovative and sustainable solutions for products used in many areas of daily life. You typically, or very rarely, will you find something with our name on it, but I can tell you that we usually say that any given point in time throughout the whole day, you won't be more than 3-4 feet away from something that was made either from or with our products. And the main segments that we serve include automotive, construction, furniture, electronics, appliance, as well as healthcare. And for those investors in the audience, we had just a little bit short of 11 billion euros worth of sales last year, and roughly about 6,500 employees worldwide. So now you may ask how a chemical company fits environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, into its strategy, and how we can do that profitably. So at Covestro, the 3 pillars of our strategy all touch ESG, and I would say in a big way. And I'll very briefly touch on those 3 strategic pillars. And so first, we want to become the best of who we are. Now, I would say that sounds simple, but it truly focuses on our most important resource, our people. This means ensuring the organization is designed to maximize employee potential and supports our efforts to tailor our business even more closely to the needs of our customer. It also means driving diversity, equity, and inclusion into all areas of our business, as well as doing good in the communities we call home. And I say this is just a snapshot of activities, but it's of fundamental importance to Covestro. Second, we want to drive sustainable growth, and we want to do so in a profitable way. And using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or short UN SDGs, we're using them as a roadmap. We have designed our growth strategy in a way to ensure that the future profitability of Covestro does not come at the cost of people or the planet. We're actively aligning our R&D work with the UN SDGs to help ensure our materials are directly impacting society sustainably. And recently we announced the acquisition of the resin and functional materials business of DSM, which further expanded our sustainable product lines with about 1 billion euros worth of sales. And the third part of our strategy is that we strive to our vision to become fully circular. We announced this vision last year, instead have made some significant strides. Now this builds upon our drive for sustainable growth. and certainly looks at how we can become the most, get the most out of the carbon that we're using. And while this may be a long-term vision, we are already well on our way to closing energy and material cycles and transitioning to a fossil-free economy. Next slide, please. So given the alignment of our products and the strategy with ESG agenda, you might wonder, how does Covestro measure its progress in the ESG space, and what are our targets? Well, as you can see on this slide here, we use several mechanisms to measure and report our performance related to ESG. And we have established 5 measurable non-financial targets that encompass many areas of our business, from our emissions to R&D projects to supply chain to positively impacting people in its underserved market. And of course, advancing our vision to become fully circular. So we already have made quite substantial progress on these ambitious targets, including aligning about 50% of our R&D expenditures with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, supporting over 1 million people in underserved markets, and reducing our specific greenhouse gas emission by 46%, which is well on our way to our target of a 50% reduction by 2025. And while these metrics are reported externally, they are internal targets that we set and strive to meet. Now, beyond that, we also use various other external mechanisms to measure our performance in the ESG space. Some of these include the Global Reporting Initiative, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, and also other ESG ratings and indices. And I certainly also would be remiss if I did not touch on our commitment to responsible governance, which not only aims to have a broad skill set based on diverse board representation, but also build sustainable performance into the compensation system via greenhouse gas emission factor. So for those that are interested, we have a complete review of our ESG performance. It's part of our annual report, and it is available at any given time on our website. And I think I'll end my introduction there, Duane. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Haakan. Very, very interesting opening, and it gives us a real window into what chemical companies are doing to drive down emissions and implement the full agenda of ESG. I had a question as you were going through there that has come up a lot. And in your opinion, how should we include or think about the downstream benefits of products in terms of avoiding emissions and so forth?
Yeah, the chemical industry, we are certainly critical of achieving efficient and effective climate change solution, and they certainly provide significant downstream benefits. I say that at Covestro, our mission is focused on how our materials make the world a brighter place. And in recent years, we have really looked at our mission through an ESG lens. For example, insulation made from polyurethane foam over its lifetime saves more than 70% of the amount of energy that was used to produce it. And that has significant environmental benefit for the downstream users. And obviously that's always been the case. What we are focused on now is how can we produce that material in a cleaner, less energy intensive way. And at the end of the life of the product, how could we then reintroduce it into the value chain? So as I mentioned, that one of our ESG targets is to align 80% of R&D with the UN SDGs by, sorry for that, with the UN SDGs by 2025. And a lot of that is taking the proven benefits of our chemistries. I'm getting phone calls here, sorry, by 2025. A lot of it is taking proven benefits of our chemistries and improving upon them. Now, making them more sustainable, be it in a process improvement, alternative raw materials, advanced recycling, or other mechanisms. I would say at the end of the day, we know the products we produce can and do improve modern society. And I would say now it's up to us to ensure that ESG is incorporated into every step of our business.
Thanks. I wanted to ask one more question. You've had a fair bit of success with bio-based feedstocks and materials. Could you just comment on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Bio-based will be one key, and I mentioned it, that one of our target, in fact, our vision, that is to advance the circular economy and to become fully circular. Part of that, the strategy to achieve that vision leans to the advancement of alternative raw materials, of which bio-based is a key component, right? So at Covestro, we already are working on numerous bio-based products and expect that to expand moving forward. In our portfolio, we already have partially bio-based coatings. We have polycarbonates on bio-based basis, and as well as polyurethanes. Now, in terms of end markets, how it looks today, it will look like tomorrow, because the building blocks are the same. So we make the same polymers, it's just that we make them with a different starting material. So the difference is that you produce from biomass, not fossil-based sources. And one great example is aniline, and it's a very important material for us. It's used in the production of MDI, and that is one of the main components of rigid foams. And we have an aniline that is based on biomass, which then can be used in the production of MDI and ultimately used as rigid foam for insulation of homes, as well as refrigerators that keep our beer cold, right? So at Covestro, we see these types of bio-based products playing a very, very important role moving forward. Absolutely.
Thanks, Haakan. Really enjoyed your remarks. I'm going to turn it over now to Josh and take it away, Josh.
Sure. Thanks, Duane, and thanks everyone for joining. And also thanks, Julie, for joining as well. I think what would be interesting to start is if you can give the audience a view on how ESG is approached from a finance and investment perspective. And given the amount of experience you have in your role dealing with ESG, how have things changed over the past 5 to 10 years? Obviously, it's more visible, but are things being done and talked about differently today?
Okay, thanks, Josh. So thanks very much indeed for inviting me this evening in the UK. If I had a cold beer nearby in the fridge, I might even avail myself of that, no doubt insulated by some of the material you just mentioned. So I'll talk a bit about what we do from a sell-side research perspective. And I think the first thing to think about is what we're doing in sell-side research the whole time, and Josh can correct me if he disagrees, is I think we're trying to connect information to share prices ultimately. And the way of doing that is basically to understand how an industry works, what competitive conditions are like, how firms compete, basically where the competitive advantage comes from against peers, and then how that feeds through eventually to the financials and to the models. So we're sitting in the middle of an absolutely fantastic resource, which is a large number of top analysts. And in ESG, we've always reasoned that the people who best understand ESG factors for companies are actually covering analysts, because we're an ESG team, we're generalists, we cover absolutely everything. And there's just no way we can understand the industry to the same depth as our analysts. So in ESG, we do exactly what we're doing in fundamental research. And that generally means that we have a very good working relationship across research. And I guess the second thing that implies is we're looking at ESG in a particular way. And the way I guess that could be described is ESG integration. And what we're looking for the whole time is that touch point between environmental factors, social factors, and what companies are actually doing. And we actually have a survey which goes around internally, and we just basically say to the analysts, okay, what drives your industry? What are the differentiating competitive strengths that sort the successful from the less successful companies? What are the business as usual balances of risks and opportunities, and what are your main financial metrics? Okay, now we've got your industry on the postcard. tell us which environmental or social or governance factors would change model strategy metrics or balance of risk. And that's essentially how we get to our materiality map of key ESG risk factors. Now, we really like the SASB materiality map. That's a really nice matrix of factors by sector, but we're always going to have a shorter list. And the reason for that is we want the particular ESG factors that connect in the context of fundamental analytics for our mainstream analysts. And that's where we think we add value in our product. But having said that, I always step back and say, if you think about ESG, there's no really right way of doing it. We actually have a list of 7 or 8 different approaches. And many of them you will have talked about. So you will have heard of exclusion, positive and negative screening, ESG integration, which is what we do, sustainable investing, impact investing, social entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all different flavors of a similar idea where everybody is thinking about ESG and sustainability and responsibility. So what determines which one you look at? So it's where you are in the ecosystem of financial services and systems. So if you think about buy side, then designing products and investment ideas, that will very much come from what their clients need and from market beliefs. Do you think markets are efficient or not? That will determine whether you do ESG or whether you think actually looking at ESG analytically speaking won't make any difference. The flip side of that is, what does it mean for companies? So from an analytical perspective, we want companies to tell us about what is most relevant, most material. And I think investors and clients would like that, and sell-side analysts would also like that. And very often you hear people say, oh, sell-side analysts never ask any ESG questions, but I don't actually think that's true. What we're always interested in, all of us across the board, mainstream analysts and ESG analysts, is where are those material factors? What is really core to the industry? And actually, we've already mentioned some of those ideas today in the presentation so far. And then in terms of how this has changed, so I'll share that 15 years ago, I said, okay, well, this is going to become really, really big. So I got that bit right. But I also said ESG teams would disappear. And I actually thought by now I probably would have talked myself out of a job because ESG would be fully integrated. And of course, the opposites happened. Right? So I was completely wrong about that one. ESG teams have become more and more prolific across firms, and they have greater depth of expertise, and there are more people in them. And what's really driving that is the rather breathtaking speed with which we've seen climate change move forward. So that has been really, I think, a bit shocking for all of us. And even things like COVID, really bring it home that we're very embedded in the environment and it can really shape things. So I think stuff happening in real life, awareness, has hugely boosted the sector. And it means that in essence, everybody is now doing this, and you can't do research or investment or be a company, I think, without actually having some sort of ESG input. And that's really the biggest change. So we've moved from SRI, socially responsible investment, which used to be regarded as a little marginal sector, and it was maybe 2 or 3% of assets under management for buy side. We've moved to something now which is just system wide, and it's been a really exciting journey to go through. And I imagine it will change again in the next 10 to 15 years.
Thanks, Julie. That's a really helpful overview, and appreciate your insights. I guess in your comments, you mentioned that you're a generalist, so you're not covering one specific sector. You're looking across the whole map. I guess in terms of what you see, and keep in mind, most of the audience is in some way, shape, or form touching the chemicals industry. Is there some industry or sector which you would say is ahead in terms of either ESG targets or communications, et cetera, that you think that the chemical industry can learn from and maybe steal some best practices?
So I don't think any sector is necessarily ahead or behind, because going back to where I started, every industry is different. Some industries will have more quote unquote externalities than others, fossil fuels being an obvious example. For other industries, it's very easy to produce sustainable products and services, and the economics just kind of work. Sometimes that changes. So if you think about the alternative energy industry now it's running under its own steam. The economics work because that learning curve has happened. The costs have fallen. So now it basically doesn't need to be subsidized, but at the beginning it did because the costs just didn't work out. So I always tend to look first at the competitive landscape and where the impediments and blockers are and where the things that would push ideas forwards are. So, and some of those are not within the gift of, companies in the industry may not have any control over that. So for example, how fast carbon regulation moves is going to happen, and it's a government regulation, society-driven thing, and companies are not in control of that. They may be able to control their strategies and get a jump ahead of what they see to be developing regulation. So I wouldn't say anybody is necessarily behind or ahead, but I do happen to think that the chemicals industry is really interesting because it is just involved in so many different industries. So Jonsson described that right at the beginning. You're not, how many feet did you say it was? You're not more than about 3 feet away from something. I think that applies generally. You're not more than maybe a couple of inches away from chemicals and chemical materials and stuff you're using to keep warm, to prepare your food, to go up and downstairs, to, in your furnishings and what have you. So chemicals go through everything, and there are going to be multiple ways in which new products and ideas can have very positive effects. And then of course the flip side is there are key ways in which the industry can see it needs to move forwards. If you take, you've already mentioned the circular economy, circularity. I think that's phenomenally difficult to deliver. In its simplest form, closed loop, it's very easy. And where companies can do that, that's absolutely great. And often enough, there are cost savings too. But if you were going to try and do circular economy across industry and across the system, that's actually much harder. And it may require a collaborative model rather than a competitive model. So I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a very good answer to your question, but just to confirm, I think the chemical sector in general is really interesting. And you can see that actually in the work recently put out by Andrew Stott, who's the head of European chemicals. So he's done a whole big piece on ESG and chemicals, actually.
Okay, no, thanks for that, Julia, and we appreciate the plug for chemicals more broadly. I guess when it comes to chemicals, in a lot of my conversations, a lot of focus is on the E part of the equation, or the environment. I'd be curious, how do ESG-focused investors weigh the social and governance side more broadly, and do the weights of kind of the three dynamics change depending on the industry you're looking on that? And the last piece within this context is, as you look across there, is there any low-hanging fruit you think chemical companies could take advantage of, when talking to ESG investors or telling their story?
So starting with the last one first, I think taking what's core to the business model and talking about that and explaining how it fits into the ESG landscape is absolutely the top thing to do. And then as far as environment versus social, again, how much you talk about those different things should be determined by the model itself. And so, for example, in certain segments of the chemical industry, say in R&D, it's kind of an obvious thing to say that human capital really matters. But how the human element is managed, and how R&D depths of skill and so forth are brought forward is really important. I don't think anybody looking at particularly specialty chemicals companies would disagree with me in saying that. So I think it's to take the core model and then look at what is really the most important in driving that model forward, and that's where your key ESG factors are. And then governance I tend to take as a slightly separate idea. So I think environmental and social issues are, they sort of cross between companies and sectors and the outside world and markets. Governance tends to be much more to do with country environments, the legal culture, the accounting culture, and then of course also corporate practice. And actually corporate governance is something that's been around for a very, very long time. I mean, if you're an investor, the minute you hold shares, you're involved in corporate governance because as a minimum you vote and so forth. E&S is something that has become much bigger, and certainly from my part, that's in research, that's where we tend to put a lot of the weight.
Thanks, Julie. That's helpful. I'm going to turn the call back to Duane to pull Kyle into the conversation here. Hey, Duane, you may be on mute.
How about that? Thank you. Josh. I appreciate that. Yeah, Kyle, I think given that you're working in the market with companies that are really trying to make changes, maybe just start with an overview of kind of what's going on, what that's all about these days.
Yeah, very happy to, Duane. Thank you for that. We used to have a really nice, tidy slide about the state of ESG, and we would, update it maybe once or twice a year, for our clients to start conversations. And now that's almost like an exercise in futility, right? I feel like we almost have to have daily or weekly updates to be providing sort of the best set of updates, to talk about this topic, just because the dynamic, the rate of change has just been extraordinary in the level of interest. So I'm gonna flag a handful of highlights. Some of them are even from yesterday's news, just to flag a few things I think are really important for us to consider as we continue this conversation. The way our team summarizes ESG is there's really no turning back right from here. And I think the reason is because the numbers are so big. I mean, if you just look at some of the macro forces that we can discuss, 2019, just in the US, we had $137 billion of damage from natural catastrophes. The International Energy Agency sees the need for about $550 billion to reach the Paris net zero goal. I mean, even sentiment data, right? Millennials, 67%, Gen Z, over 80%, think ESG has to be part of what companies deal with. So those kind of macro factors, and of course there's others, just show how big this is. Obviously the investor community and sentiment's been pretty strong. Over 500 investors, $47 trillion. We have supported the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD that was mentioned before. That's a really big number. CalPERS, their whole portfolio has to have climate risk as part of each account. Another thing we saw from our M&A team, by the way, I've been with Deloitte about 11 years, the first 8.5 of which I never did one due diligence project in M&A around ESG. Now we have 20 currently, right? It's just exploding right now. And it's because 90% of company market value is in intangible assets. And so how do you start measuring these things into valuation has become a really big thing as well. We all know with the change in administration, there's been a lot of talk. There's a lot of expected on ESG topics, from disclosure requirements under the Biden-Harris administration to rejoining Paris. The SEC has already taken steps to potentially expand into non-financial disclosures. Yesterday, some of my colleagues were in a meeting with Gina McCarthy, who's a White House advisor on climate, and we were really, taken back by how significant the renewable energy commitments are and the time frame that they're on and how they're not wavering from that. And we talked about, I'm talking a lot about the E part of ESG, but the S part is really being woven into E, in that the idea of social justice, racial justice in particular, tied with environmental matters, is absolutely being correlated with these topics from the administration. I think that's really important to bear in mind. And even earlier this week, the Fed announced issues with regards to climate risks because they see it as a critical role of the Fed, because they're responsible for the health of the banking system in the United States. So it's really interesting, to hear those kinds of comments. And so what it translates to is companies are incredibly active. I mean, over 1,600 are part of TCFD. Over 1,000 have already set science-based goals for greenhouse gases. Our clients are coming to us just, just as a proxy kind of data point from Deloitte. They're racing towards more reporting. And frankly, the intention is to be very holistic in that reporting. And I would say they're planning on things like integrated reporting as something that they see not on their long-term radar, but their short-term radar. So that's changed a lot, Duane, right, over the last couple of years. And so let me just stop there with those set of highlights, and happy to go through a couple of questions as well.
Yeah, something that is on my mind, as you mentioned, all of the action and activity is as we start to think specifically about the chemical sector. It's definitely known as it's an industry based on carbon largely. It's known as hard to abate, or at least characterized that way by some. So how do we apply what you just talked about to thinking through the impact on the chemical industry?
Yeah, it definitely gets tagged as one of these hard to abate sectors. And we know there's some solutions that are available today that a company can take on to fix. But I think the mentality for the sector that's particularly important for a hard to abate sector like chemicals, you have to think beyond your company. Some of the solutions that we need to implement that need to be sort of readied from a feasibility standpoint or a scale standpoint, one company's activity isn't enough. It has to be collaboration across the industry to get sort of to the next tier of solutions and opportunities. And then I think even more importantly, because the core issues with regards to the abatement in the chemical industry have to do with macro forces like the availability of plentiful, low cost, clean power. Those things need to be coordinated across many industries, frankly, right? So I think kind of getting outside of a company thinking about its own challenges and how to address it and being much more collaborative across the industry and beyond the industry is essential to the main levers for decarbonization.
That's interesting. And what are some, whether it's in the chemical industry or not, what are some of the boldest moves you've seen companies make in these areas?
Yeah, I think the boldest move I would actually say is in philosophy. And I know there was a comment that came through in the chat, and I think it's a really good comment about, it's not about companies doing less bad and talking about it through ESG. It's companies really thinking about this as offense. Is how can I use this as an opportunity to transform our brand, what we do? How can we use this as a differentiator? You know, when it comes to chemicals, you know, chemicals in ESG always haven't been, you know, thinking about things doing good, but let's face it, chemistry is science, and chemistry can fix things. Chemistry can address challenges we have in food, challenges we have in water, challenges we have in lightweighting products. I mean, all of those things are really important. So I think the biggest thing to me, Duane, is this really healthy transition to an offensive mentality.
I think that's a good wrap up to your section, and I think a lot of folks are looking forward to question answer for the whole group, and I'm going to turn it over to Josh for that.
Sure, thanks, Duane. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, type it into the Q&A, and we'll try to work it in. You know, I guess maybe to go back to Haakan first is, you know, I think talking about net zero and carbon neutrality is becoming a bigger topic these days. I guess from your view and what Covestro is doing, is the technology at a point where that's achievable over the next 10, 20 years? And if not, what needs to develop for the industry to really get there in a realistic manner?
Yeah, maybe let me talk a little bit what we are doing at Covestro, right? And before I said it, I agree with what Kyle said 100%. We see this an opportunity, right? We are certainly Covestro. We are seeing this as offense. This is not defense, right? So, but so I would say that there's two aspects to that. Certainly, we want to make sure that we're doing as much as we can today to reduce carbon emission, while maintaining an eye towards the future, where we want to ensure that we maximize the benefit we get from the carbon that will be used, right? So the difference is in the shorter term, we look at things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions through, I would say, more traditional methods, such as increasing efficiencies in our production and utilizing renewable energy when possible. And as was also mentioned here, we recently announced 2 major renewable energy agreements that will power a significant part of our European energy needs. And that includes one with the Belgian energy producer Engie that will produce or that will be used to power 45% of our production in the Antwerpen site from an electricity point of view. Now, looking forward, so that is what we're doing today. So looking forward, what we need to do, so in the longer term, our vision is for a circular economy to become fully circular and fossil free. And there are 4 core drivers of this vision. Some of that, some of the other participants I mentioned already. But to repeat some of it again, that the first one is to use alternative raw materials, be that biomass, we already touched on that. We use carbon dioxide or even others to replace the fossil resources. The second core driver is to advance innovative recycling technologies that allow more waste materials to be recycled. Third, and as I just mentioned, as part of our short-term strategy as well, to incorporate renewable energy such as wind and solar, because renewable energy must power the circular economy. And the fourth core driver would be so that, and Kyle said it as well, right? We really need to collaborate cross-industry and to find joint solutions to bring a circular economy to life, because no company alone will be able to accomplish this, right? And I would also say that currently, Covestro, we have projects or partnerships in every one of those 4 areas that I just mentioned. So to sum it up, in both the short and the long term, we have our sights focused on emissions and sustainability more broadly as well, right? So that's what do we do today, and what do we need to go in the future, if that is somebody in 10 to 15 years, or even in some cases to the fully circular, even maybe a longer time horizon than that.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe to kick one over to Julie, is when we look at chemical companies, the question is, if you're improving your metrics, so like Haakan's talked about, lowering emissions, improving circularity, how does that compare to an ESG investor that looks at that versus a company which already have a very clear kind of sustainability ESG vision? Is that looked at separately, differently? What comments can you share around that?
So I'd say that investors look at both of those. And, there's that old saying, it's better to travel than to arrive. And I think if there's a shift out there, one of these big secular changes, and companies are adapting towards that, that can be very interesting as long as the execution is there. So anytime you have a change, obviously that's a risk. But then in any kind of change, that's also where the opportunities are. And I guess the other thing to think about, it's very well known that if you have a company that's well established as the leader in the sector, well, it tends to be relatively highly rated. Everybody knows the company really well, whichever one it might be. And so it's actually very hard to deliver any kind of excess return, if you're an active investor, and that's what you're hoping to do. So I think a far more interesting spot is actually where the transitions are happening. And in fact, in ESG, we have these 4 risk groups, and one of our groups is actually called competitive transition. And this is where companies are pivoting into a new model. I think that's a very interesting area, whether you're an ESG specialist or not.
Okay, no, thank you for that insight. And maybe a similar thought for Kyle, just in terms of as tracking and reporting, if you're on an improvement path, that becomes more important. I guess, how do you deal with kind of the audit and verification of some of that data? And I guess when I think about greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, somewhat easy to measure and track, I think. Scope 3 is pretty vague. So in terms of the emissions from your products downstream and changing consumer behaviors, how are you monitoring that to assure that there's not double counting or some double dipping across different companies or channels?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I agree. Scope 1 and 2 is a little easier for us to draw a box around and do the calculations within, whether it's fuels being used or power being purchased. For the most part, those things are fairly straightforward. You're right. There's a lot of I guess it is part vague when you get into scope 3, but it's just so big. It's what you're asking, Josh, is like how do we measure the entire world, right? In some ways, when you start talking about scope 3, especially with really big companies with such expansive supply chains and impacts. One of the tools that's been around for a long time it's certainly a good one is using life cycle assessment. It does allow you to be much more holistic when you're looking at a product or service And I think it can be really helpful in identifying the big areas that are important for improvements. So we see that as a tool that's been used extensively. Even in some of the work that we're doing with chemical companies and even in the broader sector, we're paying very careful attention to key issues like feedstocks, right? How do we understand them? Where are they coming from? How are they made? So we're very deliberately looking into some of those scope 3 matters. One of the other things that is hard to measure on scope 3, but absolutely needs to be part of the discussion, is a lot of the impacts of some of the products that we're talking about in the sector are incredibly important. In fact, absolutely necessary if we're to change fuel economy or the effectiveness of battery technology and the things that we need for a clean economy transition. I am actually less worried about double counting issues in scope 3 more than I am making sure we're having a robust conversation about it to get back to that topic of collaboration. Because if you're going to transform a product, I'll just pick something different from this industry. Pretend we want to have a carbon neutral hamburger, right? The carbon neutral hamburger isn't about who gets credit. Is it McDonald's, or is it Cargill, or is it one of the ranchers that sells to Cargill? It's actually all of them, right? It's all of them. And I think the double counting issue, I'm less concerned about for now until we can actually get through some meaningful collaborations to radically change the footprint of a hamburger, for example.
No, thanks. That's a helpful way to look at it. I'll allow anybody to answer this who feels best suited, but we've got a number of questions around administration changes in the US. So, first, do you think ESG reporting becomes more regulated under the current administration? And let's just say another administration steps in another few years from now. Is there room to reverse what's being done now and change things? Or, how do you see some of that playing out?
Who wants to take it?
Well, yeah, who wants to jump into that one?
I'll take a first crack only because of proximity to Washington, D.C. is very close for me. I do think there's reason to expect more ESG regulations for this administration. I mean, clearly they're putting a lot of pressure on the topics. I think the question is how collaborative can that be, between the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, because there's just been very few areas of agreement. So I expect a bit of fighting. I'll say with regards to a potential change in administration, the previous administration, I saw a lot of ESG trends like become actually the hottest they've ever been in the 23 years I've been working on this over the last 3 years. Right. And I actually think the trend is here to stay. I think it's going to be independent of an administration from our perspective.
And just to add to that, the global context. So you have, as you know, an enormous initiative going on in Europe with the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and other regions are working on this as well. So I think you're right, it's a global trend and everything is supporting this. And I think at the bottom, it goes down to the fact that real changes are happening. So climate change is real, COVID is real, inequality is real, just transition is needed, all of that. So these are real world factors that are driving all of this forward. So I think you're right. I think there's a real headwind behind it. No, tailwind behind it. Wrong way around.
Yeah, maybe I'll just briefly comment on that as well. As Julie said, certainly it all has to happen in the context of competitive landscape, not only domestically, but also we need to keep in mind the different regulatory requirements in different countries, in different regions of the world, right? And that certainly can have a big effect on the level of decarbonization required to do business in turn on the cost and the, can you still make money or not, right? So now on that front, I would say that the political mindset of simply punishing carbon emitters through regulations or trade barriers might not be the best approach. So a more productive tactic, in my opinion, would be for the governments to work to promote investments, in state-of-the-art manufacturing processes, Or why not expand access to federal grants, support R&D into carbon capture technologies, increase availability of capital for investments in things like emission reducing research technologies, right? And to continue the policy efforts to foster adoption of renewable energy sources. Absolutely, as I said before, renewables will be key to be successful here. So again, there is no easy answers, right? But certainly I think that I see tendencies going in the right direction. But again, we all need to work together from the government through the industries and so on and so forth, right? Absolutely.
Thanks for all the thoughts around that, everyone. I have a couple questions that came in around circularity versus, really, improving emissions and changing that, the carbon side of the equation. I guess, Haakan, maybe start with you, and Julie, be curious if you have any opinion about kind of the dynamics of the two. So when you bring in bio-based materials, you're not necessarily addressing the end-of-life issue with a lot of products. So how do you see industry approaching that, Haakan?
Yeah. So I saw some of the questions, so let me address some of that, right? Because I saw some comment about it need to be recyclable and so on and so forth, and how do we deal with that? And I'm going to use an example of something that we all know, and that is the mattress we sleep on at night, right? And so you can use different raw materials when you produce it, right? And we have something that it's mattresses made by two base products. It's a polyol and an isocyanate, right? And they make the polyurethane, they make the foam. We have developed a polyol, it's called Cardion, and that is use up to 20% of waste carbon dioxide instead of oil to make the polyol. So if you remember what I said before, this is one of our core drivers for circular economy, that is alternative raw materials, in this case, carbon dioxide. So that is also in parallel with using biomass, but in this case, it's carbon dioxide. So check one, we don't go back to oil to get the raw materials. The second part of that is that, and we just announced that we are starting up a pilot plant that using advanced recycling, the chemical recycling process called chemolysis, to be technical here, right? And here we take the used old mattresses and we chemically break them down into the two key raw materials, the isocyanate and the polyol that I just mentioned. And those can then be reintroduced into the production process to produce new mattresses. So again, remember, this is another core driver for a circular economy, using advanced recycling technologies. And as I mentioned before, the third, so that was check two, right? We reuse, we don't put it in the landfill, we don't make, bad park benches or whatever, or we actually bring it back into the cycle again, right? So we use the carbon again, right? The third, just as we mentioned before, the check mark then is obviously to fuel all this, so to say, we need renewable energy, right? And so if we do that, we don't go back to oil for the starting material. We bring it after end of life, we bring back the material again into loop, and we use renewable energy. Then I would say that the challenge that we had in the past of window dressing or not cannot be stated anymore. As I said before, this is the vision, and we're heading in that direction in Covestro. I'm not saying we're going to be fully there tomorrow, but we are fully committed to this circular economy. So I don't know if that answers the question that I saw here in the chat, but certainly that's the approach we take, right? One of the approaches, I should say.
And I'll just talk about a couple of reports that we've written about different sectors, but which do connect indirectly to chemicals. So my colleague Vicky has just written a report on fast fashion, because basically fashion is bought, worn once, thrown away. The question is, when will people stop buying $5 t-shirts and throwing them away? It's polluting, huge carbon emissions, lots of it goes to landfill. And then a year or two ago, we also wrote about plastic, and there's a similar problem there, which is that single-use plastic is used, and then it's thrown away and it ends up in the environment. And you've seen everything in the press, pictures of plastic ending up in fish and on mountains and at the bottom of the sea and in the air you breathe. So the whole idea of circularity, those things not getting out into the environment but being invested back in the loop, is clearly very appealing. And I guess the question to put on the table was, what would that mean actually for the overall system? So one question we asked a year or two ago was, there's an economist called Václav Smil who talks about the river economy, and it's the amount of stuff, so materials, that go through the economy and then end up, they're just taken, procured, used, thrown away. And we basically had a client brainstorming one day, and the question all the clients wanted to ask, but didn't know the answer to, was what happens if the river economy slows down? And I sort of suspect that to get circularity, things might need to go more slowly. And I'm not quite sure how that would work. I suspect the collaborative model we're all talking about might mean that too. So I'm kind of answering a question with another question. But certainly you ask a great question there. It's obviously very, very, very fundamental to what we're talking about here in ESG. And
Thanks.
It goes without saying that it is obviously very bound up with carbon emissions, which I think was the other bit of your question. I mean, I think going more and more circular would have an impact on carbon emissions.
Yeah, thanks both for the thought, and understand these are not straightforward answers. Let me check in with Duane real quick. I've been told if we go over time, I'm going to be fired. So I don't know if we have time for another question or if this is a good place to wrap up. So Duane, your call.
Well, maybe we can have a quick lightning round question. So, sort of the quick 1 or 2 word answer. So what's going to be the most popular storyline in ESG in the next year? Why don't we start with Haakan? You're on mute, Haakan.
Okay, sorry about that.
No.
I would say that the storyline is that, as was pointed out, ESG here to stay. It's not the topic of the day. It's here to stay, and at Covestro, we are certainly fully committed to ESG and a circular economy.
How about you, Julie?
So I guess I would completely agree with the idea that ESG is here to stay, and it's embedded and it's everywhere. And then within ESG, it's kind of stating the obvious, but I think climate change and related topics like biodiversity and then inequality, just transition, I think all of those are really important this year.
Kyle?
I mean, climate, I think climate is the dominant topic, the critical topic of our time. So that will continue to dominate.
And Josh, what do you think?
I'd agree. I mean, it's definitely, I focus on chemicals and packaging companies, and it's a bigger part of the conversation. So I don't see it going away. It's probably a bigger question of how it's addressed and how things evolve, but certainly not going away.
I think we're going to hear a lot about it in the coming year. So I really want to thank all the panelists, and Josh as co-moderator was excellent. Thanks to the Societe for allowing this group to come together and to have a good conversation with the audience. We look forward to future sessions for Societe, and just last time, my thanks to each and every one of you on the panel. That concludes our discussion. Have a good day.